This screencast is going to explain about equivalent fractions. This is a concept that you should have learned about in either 4th or 5th grade during your fraction unit. And so we're not going to spend too much time working on this, but just a little quick recap video. So just to get us started, let's go ahead and talk about what an equivalent fraction is. So when you are looking at equivalent fractions, they are basically fractions that equal the same thing, but they look different. So once again, equivalent fractions are fractions that look different but equal or represent the same amount. So let's go ahead and talk about how you would find equivalent fractions. There are two ways to find equivalent fractions. The first way is to use multiplication, so to multiply, and the second way is to divide. So basically what you need to remember is that when you are multiplying or dividing, whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So in this case, if you're multiplying, you would multiply the numerator, the top number, and the denominator, or the bottom number, by the same number. And when you're multiplying, it does not necessarily matter what number you multiply by. You could multiply by any number. You could multiply by 2, 27, 33, 100. It does not matter as long as you are multiplying the numerator and denominator by the same number. When it comes to division, it's a little bit more particular. It's a little more exact because you have to look for a number that goes into both your numerator and denominator. So it has to be a number that can be divided into the top number and the bottom number. So when you're dividing, you have to divide the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So really, when you're thinking about this, you want to look for a common factor or a common number that would go into both the numerator and the denominator. So if we take a look at this example shows your thirds relationship. So we have 1/3 here, and you'll see that 1 out of 3 rectangles is shaded in. Then they're telling us that 1/3 is equal to 2/6, because if we draw the same length of a rectangle and we split it into 6 parts, you'll see that 2 out of those 6 parts matches up with 1 out of those 3 parts. The other way that we could look at this is if we use the idea of multiplication because we're getting bigger. How would we go from 1 to 2? We would multiply by 2. So then we have to think about how would we go from 3 to 6. Well, in this case, we'd have to multiply by 2 because our rule is to do the same thing that we did to the top to the bottom. And 3 times 2 also gets us to 6, so we know that those are equal to one another. If you take a look at the next example, looking at 4/12, once again we can prove that 4/12 is equal to 1/3. First of all, we can look at it's the same length. Our rectangular model is the same length, split into 12 different parts, and then 4 out of those 12 parts match up with our 1/3 shaded and our 2/6 shaded. To do it mathematically, you can take a look either at 1/3 or 2/6, it doesn't matter. I'm going to take a look at 1/3 and think about how would I go from 1 to 4. I would multiply by 4. That means I have to multiply 3 by 4. 3 times 4 is 12. So once again, these are equal to one another. So at the bottom of this page, you'll see that you're just finding 4 different problems, and you're going to find the equivalent fractions for each. This kind of breaks it down into simpleton terms, in where you're just finding what number belongs in each box of the equivalent fraction. So for example, if you take a look at number 1, you're going to think 2 times what gets me to 6. So I know that 2 times 3 gets me to 6, so I'm going to put a 3 in that box. And then my rule is that whatever I multiply by on the top, I have to also multiply that same number on the bottom. So I would do 5 times 3, and that would get me to 15. So go ahead and do numbers 2, 3, and 4, and then press play and watch and check your answers. So if you take a look, number 2, you're multiplying by 2, and then your final fraction or your equivalent fraction to 1/3 would be 2/6. Number 3, you're multiplying by 5, so your equivalent fraction to 7/4 would be 35/20. And finally, in number 4, you're multiplying by 6, so your final fraction, your equivalent fraction to 5/8 will be 30/48. So remember that whatever you're multiplying on the top, you have to also multiply on the bottom, or if you're dividing, you're finding a common factor and dividing the top and the bottom by the same number.